We're not live on Facebook yet. I'll give you guys warning for that. Okay, I'm just gonna shake out any nerves. Here we go. I'm gonna wait for a few more people to come in.
Okay.
And Chuka, your lighting is perfect right now. You're good. Okay, we'll begin. So hello, good evening. My name is Kia Ellistirity. I am the project facilitator and a research assistant for cannabis and psychosis. I'm located in southern British Columbia on the land of the Coast Salish Nations. This event is in collaboration with YouthRex, Cannabis and Psychosis, and Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policies Get Sensible project. As you can see, this is a live event, so it will be hosted on Facebook and on YouTube. So if you know of any folks who might be interested in this discussion, just send them the link. And this event will be found afterwards because it's recorded on the YouthRex's Knowledge Hub and also on the Cannabis and Psychosis website. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amina. I am a research assistant with YouthRex, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm in the traditional territory of many nations here in Ontario, Toronto, of the Mississaugas of the New Credit and the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and many of diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And today we'll be discussing, the discussion is around cannabis to address the criminalization of the drug in the past and the legacy it has left behind. Just to reflect on the historical impact and engage in dialogue that pushes forward, looking at intersection between mental health and anti-racism lens so that we can develop resources, programs that address these issues. And I'll begin by introducing our panelists. The first panelist is Jordan Brandt. Jordan is of the of the Mohawk of the Bay of Quinte Taniga, and he's working in the First Nation cannabis industry since 2016 as a staff member of the Legacy of the 420 and as an advocate working with the National Indigenous Medical Cannabis Association. He is passionate and vocal on topics such as cannabis education, Indigenous rights, sovereignty, and the effects of cannabis in the Indigenous communities. Our second speaker is Chuka Ejekam, and he's a master's student in the political science Department of the University of British Columbia. He works in the BC labor movement. He's also a research associate with the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. His work focuses on reparative drug policy. So welcome, we're excited, and we have one more guest who's going to be introduced as well.
So next up is Chantel Phillips. Chantel is a medical student at the University of Toronto. Her research and advocacy interests include addressing oppression with a specific focus on harm reduction and anti-Black racism in academic, political, and health-based contexts. She's currently working as a research assistant for YouthRex and a project manager of the Black COVID Resilience Health Promotion Project with the Black Health Alliance. And this event will be an hour long, and it is very discussion based. So we're going to start off asking a few questions, and then we encourage folks to please add their questions in the comment section, and we'll hope to get to all of them. We expect that all these questions that are asked will be asked in good faith, and we will not seek to simply invalidate the realities of racism and colonialism. Thank you. So welcome everyone. The first question, How does the legacy of our drug laws continue to uphold racism in spaces outside of the criminal legal system? For example, in schools, at work, in the healthcare system, and in the foster care system?
I'll start with that if that's okay. Um, so, something to consider when you're talking about Indigenous people and, of course, Canada's past drug laws is that the majority of the laws in Canada, especially up until a certain point in history, maybe around 1980, 1990, definitely not all that long ago. In my opinion, and the majority opinions of scholars who study this topic, the majority of the laws that pertain to Indigenous people were obviously meant to set them back some way. Disenfranchisement of voting. One of the biggest policies, in my opinion, not specifically drug policies, but biggest policies holding Indigenous people back, is stems way back to the document that really founded this country, the Doctrine of Discovery, the document that the majority of Canada's land laws are based on. Basically, this document more or less secures Canada's claim over the lands, over Indigenous people's lands. Any land you hear referred to as Crown land is typically unceded land that Canada does not. They haven't negotiated for, and the entire Canadian legal system was really meant to ingrain this sense that we created these laws. This is a legal system now, and you people have to deal with it. And Indigenous people, ever since then, have been playing a significant catch-up game when land is required in any sense. Really, we're significantly land deficient. We retain, I believe, less than 1% of the land in Canada here. And especially when you are when you need significant amounts of land, such as for a large-scale grow-op, these issues really come to the forefront. It was an issue when for Indigenous farmers. It was an issue for Indigenous people who wanted to get into the tobacco industry, and it's still a significant issue today for Indigenous people looking to get into the cannabis industry, of course. Just besides those, very significant other subset of laws that in my opinion, are severely holding Indigenous people back from succeeding in these industries. The cannabis laws, drug laws in general, like many of laws in general, significantly misrepresent Black and Indigenous people. So definitely, I can't claim that. I'm making no claim that Indigenous people are the only people suffering because of these laws, because definitely any people, any visible minority, any visible person of color is going to be at risk of becoming more at risk than somebody like myself, who is an Indigenous person, but doesn't present that way right away. For example, we're not at as much of a risk as other people of color. So definitely, like the majority of laws in this country, Black and Indigenous people are always going to be significantly more impacted by, especially drug laws.
Thank you for that.
Perfect.
I can go next, if you don't mind, Chantel. So I think that one thing it's worthwhile to think about is the aggregate impacts of enforcement of drug laws. As Jordan just mentioned, drug laws are disproportionately enforced against Black and Indigenous people, both in arrests, interactions like sidewalk interactions with police, arrests. When they are arrested, they're prosecuted more aggressively. If they are convicted, then their punishments are more severe. But the injustice doesn't stop there, because, of course, once you are released from incarceration, or even if you aren't incarcerated but you still bear this conviction, that is a record, and that record makes it more difficult to get a loan or a mortgage, more difficult to travel internationally. There are a number of careers that you can't pursue, streams of education you can't enter into, and it will be a number of people will have a criminal record check on a job application. So the culmination, of course, of all of those barriers is that it exerts a sort of economic ceiling upon that person's life. But when those convictions are targeted and are focused in particular neighborhoods or in particular ethnic communities, then that ceiling becomes an aggregate ceiling on that community. And the sort of negative impacts of those economic barriers are realized in the material community, right? When people have extra money, they use it to make the space that they live in more enjoyable, something that reflects their individual personality more and gives them more joy. Whether it's fixing things in your apartment or your house, or starting a garden on your balcony, whatever it may be, but all of that comes with additional funds, right? Discretionary spending. And without those things, then when a community suffers because nobody has the opportunity to do those things, or the opportunity to do those things to improve the community through community-driven investment is significantly reduced, then there's much less incentive for corporate investment or private investment in the community. Now, I'm not one to proclaim that private investment is the answer to anything, but that it does have an impact, right? It reduces the sort of quote unquote desirability of that community, which can then have a negative impact on property values. And all of these things sort of end up in this downward spiral. And it can start with just the targeted convictions in those communities. So these things, as Jordan mentioned, they spread across the entire spectrum.
Yeah. And I'll just add, from my perspective as a medical student, even though I started medical school, I think it was the year that that cannabis was legally or legislated for recreational use. I think the history of what it means to work within a system where you are, as Black people, are infrequently given the access to care that you need. I think it's important to consider the system of access to medical cannabis, and that it requires your physician to be able to trust you, to believe that the purposes in which you're presenting for the prescription are merited. And we know, based on whether it's experiences with pain and lack of pain management, or honestly just mistrust within the system that hasn't really given us the ability to earn their trust. I can't say this with evidence, but I can say that there is a good likelihood that Black patients were not given access to cannabis for medical use, or permission for that, in a way that perhaps other communities did have access to it. And so I think it does impact the source in which you access cannabis. If it's not being used or accessed through what was then legal means, then if you were still accessing this, then it means that you also might be at a risk of being criminalized disproportionately because you weren't given access to the healthcare system. So this is something I think also it's important to consider for physicians and people within the healthcare system, and the ways that we as healthcare professionals can perpetuate this system that continues to marginalize Black and Indigenous people.
And if I may, just in support of what Chantal said, I don't know of any research that demonstrating whether or not Black people have had less access to medicinal cannabis prescriptions. But absolutely, there is research that demonstrates, whether it's explicit or implicit, doctors and physicians do believe that Black people have lesser capacity to feel pain than people of other ethnic groups, and specifically white people. So they are less believed when they claim to be experiencing pain. If they are given pain reduction drugs, they are less potent, or given in lesser amounts. And then, of course, if they're ever prescribed medication, there's immediately the suspicion that they'll abuse it or sell it or whatever it may be. So yeah, I just wanted to say that in support of what you said.
Also, definitely to round out again what Chantel was saying, you definitely hear stories a lot in the news, especially coming out a lot more now, where Indigenous people go to the emergency room for help. They're turned away. They are viewed suspiciously, or they're questioned. Are they drinking? When's the last time you had a drink? Is the almost every time the first question I hear from Indigenous people across Canada, the first question I hear when they are going in for medical help, is, have you been drinking? When's the last time you had a drink? Looping back to the initial question about drug laws, definitely I can say from personal experience, as an Indigenous person, when I went to my former family's physician, I definitely had significant troubles talking to him about medical cannabis. I'm certainly not a shy person, and wasn't shy about bringing up the subject. More or less, pretty much the only answer I got from him was, I haven't done enough research to give you an answer on that. I later then got a referral to a service, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where they have a list of licensed producers that they work with. They schedule a Skype call with a medical professional of some sort. They give you a diagnosis over that call, and then they register you with one of the licensed producers that they are getting a kickback to sign you up with. So definitely my experience, I can say, seeking to get into the legal stream wasn't positive. And I definitely hear this same story from Indigenous people. And I'm sure we can all imagine the stories that don't come out from these people, these same people that are going in to get help in the ER and being treated like they're alcoholics. So definitely, in my opinion, unequal access to just because it's legal doesn't mean everybody has access to it. And I'm sure everybody saw this, especially when medical cannabis was very first legalized in this country. I'm sure it was privileged people, very much so, who were the first in the early adopter phase, we'll say. So yeah, definitely, in my opinion, it wasn't the people who had been using cannabis. It wasn't very likely the people who had been using cannabis already for a long time to get to treat their various ailments and things like that. The people who really should have been getting legal ways to access this medicine were very likely to have received it first and foremost, in my opinion.
Yeah, and those are really great points, specifically talking about the harms that a lot of people within both the medical institutions have caused to Black and Indigenous communities. And the next question kind of looks at what kind of policies are needed to start rectifying the harms of prohibition, right? This could be reparations or amnesty or turning over previous convictions. So what would that look like? What are policies that we can start implementing or discussing moving forward?
I'll start again if nobody else has anything. I've been looking very closely at how cannabis legalization is being handled in various states. The U.S. is an interesting place to study because states have a lot of freedom to implement cannabis policies. Obviously, hasn't been made legally federally yet. So there's definitely, we're seeing a wide array of say takes on cannabis legalization. Definitely some very good elements to look at, some elements to maybe look at and say, hey, maybe that's maybe something we should stay away from. In particular, what comes to mind is a name I see come up a lot in keeping up with this research is Shalene Title in Massachusetts. So, to my knowledge, a lot of their legalization system focuses on the people who are in communities who are already heavily impacted by the previous drug laws. So that we're seeing things like first come first serve availability, we're seeing licenses that are being targeted towards Black communities. Black and Indigenous people are getting priority licensing, things like that. Maybe not reparations per se. We're definitely, that's always something we can hope for. Land back is definitely a slogan that we see a lot on Twitter nowadays. But barring anything like that happening, something logical and practical, I think most people could agree on would be to, start setting aside or targeting licenses for people who were already negatively impacted by these drug laws. I haven't seen anything for Black people or other people of color specifically. I do know that Health Canada last year, I believe, launched what they call the Indigenous Navigator Program, which is meant to be somewhat of a priority licensing stream, but really that's not quite what it is. You're definitely not guaranteed a license if you apply. There are some additional aids in place for Indigenous people who might not be able to pay a lawyer to fill out the giant stack of applications for them and things like that. So it's not exactly a great program in my opinion. I haven't heard of anybody successfully completing a license through it. We're definitely not seeing a huge influx of Indigenous licensed producers. And I'm sure many of you know that from the retail perspective of things, that's handled almost pretty much entirely by the provinces. So any supports in the federal stream with that isn't going to assist people with obtaining a retail license specifically. Now, in Ontario, we did have 25 licenses set aside specifically for First Nations communities. And that was a start. Definitely, it's something. I don't know what the current number of retail locations here in Ontario right now is up to. But the I know the overall percentage, those 25 licenses is still a fairly small percentage of the overall licenses that have been granted so far, and we haven't seen any indication of more licenses that are going to be set aside for Indigenous communities. And definitely, I think actually, I was going to say we're reaching a turning point, but I think we already have surpassed the turning point to where a lot of these companies are starting to establish significant markets here in Ontario. And so Indigenous people, just like when federal legalization happened for recreational cannabis, there definitely wasn't, and still isn't today, a large number of Indigenous communities getting in on the producer side of things, and we're still seeing relatively small number of communities getting into the retail side of things as well.
I would say that there regarding repairing the harms of prohibition, there are, I think, three things to think about, at least three things to think about. The first is, of course, universal proactive expungements. It should go without saying that the application of the laws was unjust. The application must be erased. The second is reparative programs. So I'm somewhat actually critical of the priority license programs and equity permit programs. Not that they exist, but that they are offered as a move toward justice, because I don't think that is a reparative program. It's one that sort of reflects the inequity in the market, the inherent inequity in the market. But the people whose lives have been grievously impacted by drug laws or drug convictions, those equity permit programs, certainly don't give them the time back. And it doesn't track to me that just because you have a cannabis conviction on your record, that should be your primary career option in the future. So I think that everything that having a criminal conviction makes it more difficult for you to do, there should be public programs which offer those opportunities specifically to the people who have those convictions. And I think that I think that the revenues, you could use revenue from the cannabis industry. I don't think you have to. I think that there's a lot of very wealthy people in this country and a lot of people who use tax havens, just saying. But the third thing, I think, is that we have to recognize that the harms of prohibition are global, right? And as drug prohibition was global, so are the harms. And the profitable illicit drug markets in Canada and the US and Western Europe have had really significantly grievous impacts in a lot of countries, particularly countries in Latin America, in which major drug production or transit operations were set up. Operations which have gone on to amass enough power to affect the national politics of those countries. Not only that, the war on drugs, as scholar Don Paley writes incredibly compellingly about, the war on drugs has been used as an effective cover for sort of corporate imperialism, opening countries to American corporate interests and American corporations, or open other countries' markets to American corporate interests and American corporations. That's without getting into the sort of the military-industrial complex and sort of America's military interests and all of these other things. And so there's just the impact of the war on drugs has been, as again, across sectors, across countries, and millions of people have had their lives ruined or ended. And to repair that, right, it's a century of this harm that gets each year more horrific. And so repairing that, I think, will require at least that amount of time of dedicated action. Anyway, that's
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but I definitely think from the healthcare perspective as well, I think that with when we look at what prohibition has done, and even the introduction of utilizing the healthcare system as an avenue to introduce cannabis into I guess into culture, into society, then I think there needs to be a question of the physicians who had the power, and in some ways still have the power to delegate who has access to cannabis. So I think it might not necessarily be a policy, but I think a change in infrastructure and how medical students, residents, and physicians are taught about cannabis and the ways in which we engage, not just in an abstract sense, but the actual patients who are being affected. I think that's extremely important, because there's such a disconnect, I think, between the ability to sign a paper and have it potentially change someone's life and have access to pain management, and to not understand what power is held within your pen. So I think having that shift in focus within healthcare systems and how we train physicians to be equipped and prepared to take on this type of responsibility, I think that definitely needs to shift.
That's great, thank you. And you all kind of spoke towards this, but I want to focus more on the mental health aspect. So when it comes to cannabis use and mental health in racialized communities, particularly within Black and Indigenous communities, what if any has been the effect of legalization on mental health?
I think if I'll just add a point about, I do think anti-Black racism, anti-indigeneity, these concepts do impact our mental health so severely, and that if as we've been discussing thus far, legalization hasn't necessarily made an impact on Black and Indigenous communities the way that it should, or the way people might naively hope, without changes in infrastructure, I don't actually think it has severely or has impacted the mental health. I'll just give an example. My brother-in-law, he's Black, and he gets stopped by the police so frequently. And if someone were to tell him, like, okay, yeah, now you can carry up to 30 grams, dry cannabis in your pocket while you're driving, he's not going to do that. Like, he doesn't, he knows not to do that, because even if something is legal, I think, Jordan, you said this so beautifully earlier, just because something is legal doesn't mean that you have access to the same, you don't have access to law and to use law in a way that sees you as equal. So I think the mental health component of just being concerned about how you'll interact with the police system and how you'll interact with the criminal justice system because of legalization, I don't think there's been any shifts in the anxiety that comes with that or the fear that comes with that. Just in seeing like my own personal life experience and the ways in which Black men around me in my life that I love and care about would honestly not change the way that they acted before legalization for their own protection.
One thing that I would say is I think, like, discussions about mental health in communities of color, and I can speak about perhaps this one most directly in the Black community, for example, there's sort of this notion it's discussed in some way, presented sometimes, in that sort of there's this internal resistance to pursuing mental health resources or recognition of mental health concerns or something like that. I think that misses the point that in a number of cases, it can be sort of societally imposed notions of what a particular identity is supposed to be that makes one indoctrinate those ideas about themselves, right? It isn't necessarily that, if you're a young Black boy, for example, it isn't necessarily that like other Black people are telling you not to talk to anybody. It can simply be that either society is imposing upon you this idea of what a Black man is supposed to be, or there's a bunch of ignorant little white kids who are telling you what a Black man is supposed to be. And so, yeah, I feel like often it sort of gets, there's this sort of paternalistic thing where all these communities don't understand mental illness or anything like that. And I feel it's important to recognize the other thing.
Definitely. Well, I first want to speak to cannabis in Indigenous communities in general. I think cannabis itself has been a huge positive. Me personally, I believe that it's been a hugely positive thing in the communities as far as mental health is concerned. But the laws, as Chantal and Chuka just mentioned, definitely they don't always apply necessarily wholly to Indigenous people. And myself, I grew up mostly on Tyne-and-Egamont territory, which is a reservation. We don't like to call it a reservation, but it's technically, it is technically a reservation. And so my perspectives on the subject are based in that sense of the community, not necessarily the sense in the community as in Toronto. In a way, a lot like all of the Indigenous people in Toronto are all the First Nations people in a way are a community. I'm sure other people of color feel the same way about their communities as well. So I don't necessarily have the most clear perspective on that, but I haven't always lived on the territory. I've lived in Toronto. I've lived off the territory. I live off the territory now. Definitely, housing crisis is realistic on. It's definitely real in Indigenous communities. And when we talk about mental health, as far as legalization is concerned, in my personal opinion, like very little has changed for people in my community here on the territory. So I don't see definitely widespread adoption of legal cannabis. Of course, Tyne-and-Ega definitely isn't necessarily a great universal example where we have close to, I don't know, sorry, I believe we have more than 30 cannabis retail locations here in our territory, and we're a community of less than 3,000. So definitely, we're a bit of an outlier, but I would say it's probably fairly likely that the same would be said in a lot of other communities that are on reservations. With that being said, being visibly indigenous or visibly black, or you know, any other person of color outside of the territory, you experience the laws in a very different way to on territory. We have community police here. We don't have the OPP or anything like that on our territory. And when you are potentially a target every time you step outside of your front door, I'd imagine you probably have a bit of a different perspective on things. So I can't speak wholly for them, but I can say that in communities that are on reservations, that are on territory, that I've seen very little impact that broader legalization has had there.
Okay. Thank you. Those are really great answers. And we actually have a question from YouTube, and that's by Anvita. She says, what are some things that cannabis consumers in Canada should be conscious of in order to be conscious consumers?
I'll start again if that's all right. It's not easy to be a conscious consumer in Canada. The system that has arose due to recreational legalization is definitely very good at hiding who is actually growing your cannabis. So, and of course, there's other levels. There's other levels of support. You know, supporting local retailers, for example, that you know are people of color or indigenous or otherwise. Just supporting local people that you know are doing good work is a good way to be a conscious consumer. As far as, say, if you're looking to purchase cannabis from a company that is owned by Indigenous people or owned by other people of color, the branding system makes it extremely difficult. Also, we have a lot of LPs trading and selling in between each other. So just because you're buying a product from an LP doesn't mean that they grew it per se. So really, it comes down to doing your research. Find out, if you like the cannabis from a certain company, find out who's behind it, who's running it. It run by an individual person? Is it a company that an alcohol company from the States purchased into? So the information is out there, but it's definitely not easy to access. So the long and short of it is really you really have to do your research.
I think the conscious consumer is sort of the perfect term, because there's this sort of somewhat oft quoted sort of, or oft bandied about leftist phrase, there's no conscious consumption under capitalism. And it's not meant to be dispiriting, but I think the idea that the sort of economic order that has been entrenched in the world over the past centuries is fundamentally a Euro-colonial and therefore white supremacist one, and the markets in our societies reflect that. A market in which the cultivation of cannabis for maximize profit, right? Mass cultivation and mass retailing to maximize profit will always be fundamentally Euro-colonial, because it's extracting something that has cultural resonance in other parts of the world and then just treating it as a commodity, which is like, no disrespect, that's as European as it gets. And so yeah, I think that as Jordan mentioned, it is very difficult.
The only thing I would add, because that was a mic drop right there, is that I think realizing that there's buying power behind your dollar and who you decide to support. And so in addition to looking at people of color who have ownership of some type of retailer, but also thinking about what it means for you to support businesses that support infrastructure change and system level change, that there's power for some of these companies to push for further amnesty and a shifting in culture. So I think like being able to leverage your dollar, in which sounds terrible, but to leverage your dollar to force or to encourage who you're supporting to make particular decisions that acknowledge this very long set history of the ways in which Black and Indigenous people have gotten the short end of the stick. That's a euphemism, but I think it's important to consider that and how you can encourage who you're supporting to make those types of moves.
Thank you. Those are all great points. And on that same note of conscious consuming, we have a question from Heath that asks, let me see if it's going to go up there. So the question is, how do Indigenous community members feel about settlers coming onto reserves to purchase cannabis?
So I can't speak for every Indigenous community, obviously. Indigenous communities are not a monolith. With that said, definitely different communities are going to take different approaches. So there are, again, a number of stories on Tainega, and really the vast majority of the community at this point is quite supportive of the businesses. And so at that point, I would feel, very comfortable, obviously saying, definitely come on down. It's definitely would be something that the community as a whole would view as a positive. But again, there are other communities that they haven't started looking into getting into the industry, and maybe some of their members have started to push ahead of them. That is kind of how things started here in Tainega. Eventually, we did have some success in giving our band council confidence that this definitely could be of course, obviously profitable industry, but an industry that we as a community can feel morally sound about. And this is the reason that you don't see a lot of breweries in Indigenous communities and things like that. But slowly but surely, a lot of the misinformation pre-legalization is starting to get washed away. So we're starting to see a lot more community members coming around to the idea, that cannabis is medicine and things like that. There are communities, again, where there is still quite a bit of resistance from maybe the local government, local band council. But I would say that if there is a store in that community, then definitely, for sure, feel confident in going there, feel confident in at least going and checking it out, talking to the the people working there or whoever owns it if you're curious. You don't necessarily have to feel pressured to purchase anything. Definitely, as far as if there aren't any storefronts or anything like that, I can't really speak to those communities. But I definitely do believe that there's still a lot of work to be done. Going back to what Chantel said in a prior question, that education is really needed, not necessarily from a policy perspective, but definitely at least from the from the grassroots perspective, just going to your family members and having a chat with them about cannabis. There needs to be a lot more conversations had to inform people that oh, you're not going to take a puff of a joint and wind up having some crazy trip, that like in the reefer madness days kind of a thing. So definitely education is really needed, but to rectify the issue that of there being issues with cannabis on territories, but that's definitely a whole nother question.
Thank you. And we have a question from YouTube from Kira. So some folks have pointed out the whitewashing of the word cannabis to legitimize the plant. They note that weed and ganja have been used for ages and are just as legitimate. What are your thoughts about this?
I think that's an interesting question. I think that's a really interesting question. And I've thought about sort of cannabis in relation to marijuana. Of course, there's a sort of sordid history to that word. I'm not entirely certain as to all of the details of it, but ganja or weed or whatnot. I mean, I think it's like, it depends what context you're speaking, because there's a lot of sort of slang terms for alcohol, but you wouldn't write a policy about alcohol and refer to it as booze, or the sauce or what have you. So I think that, like, slang terms, there's nothing, I don't have anything against colloquial nomenclature whatsoever. But I think in a discussion of policy, it's fair to use the sort of quote unquote technical term. Determining what that technical term is or should be, I think is absolutely fair to have a discussion about that. But yeah, I think if you're writing a policy, I think it's fair to use cannabis or whatever that technical term would be. But if you're just having a discussion about it, then yeah, I think colloquial nomenclature is absolutely fine and shouldn't be viewed any differently.
Yeah, and I also think that it, like, something that I've seen that's interesting within like more health literacy spaces is, like, when you ask questions of patients, or you're engaging in conversations with people, you might use a particular term that isn't commonly used by a person, and so, like, there's value in having a set of terms that you use to make sure that you're both on the same page, and, like, also making sure when you're, like, you ask questions about not just the cannabis more broadly, but even the way that people consume cannabis. So I think, or ganja or weed or whatever it is you want to call it. So I agree. I think that, especially as it pertains to, like, reducing barriers to understanding what these products are, that using a variety of terms is super helpful.
Yeah, I just want to say I think that that's so important, because like Jordan mentioned earlier, if you're having a discussion with a physician, and the physician's trying to get information about you so they can offer healthcare services, and they want to build trust with you. If they ask you, do you smoke weed versus do you use cannabis, you will have different responses to that physician based on your familiarity with it. So yeah, I think that point is absolutely essential.
And I guess for any, like, aspiring physicians watching, you might have to still use cannabis. I'm just warning you, in front of your preceptors, but when you're with your patients, it could look a little different.
I think Chuka had a really great point about colloquialisms in say policy versus chatting on the street, and I definitely agree wholeheartedly with both of you that really either is fine. Personally, in my job, I end up speaking with a lot of elderly customers and things like that. I'm explaining cannabis and how it works to people who have never used cannabis before and things like that. In this setting, obviously, I'm using cannabis more often than, say, weed or anything else. It's definitely when I'm I wouldn't necessarily call it whitewashing per se, but obviously there are certain contexts when cannabis would be most appropriate. Obviously there are certain contexts when weed and ganja and all of the terms that we probably use most typically are used in negative senses. And definitely keeping the two separate, if you're not already a part of the industry or the culture, is confusing. And so obviously using the more maybe appropriate sounding term can at least help people or help you to think people, or help you trick people into thinking you know what you're talking about.
Amazing. And we have another question. So John asks, are there specific changes Indigenous people and people of color would like to see in regards to racial justice? And this can be in the context of cannabis education, programs, resources, or just anything in general policy.
Yeah, I think once again, just from that more like harm reduction and health perspective, and something that, you know, I think is helpful, and I've been able to see organizations such as Youth Rex engage in, is like what it means to introduce conversations about cannabis, about really any substance at an earlier age. I think having these conversations is important because I think within at least my own cultural context, there was this assumption that you just don't talk about it and no one will know what it is, you're fine. But I think that could be really problematic, because then what happens is like a lot of youth who end up using different substances, they might use it in a way that's actually more harmful for them if they just learned how to use it, I guess, more appropriately. For example, like that myth that if you like hold weed smoke in your lungs, it's gonna like make the high better, but it's like, nah, you're just jacking up your lungs. And so I think like that's something that a lot of youth probably wouldn't know, and probably still don't know. So I think regardless of what the actual decision is, like I think it's important for there to be an introduction of this type of education for the purpose of protecting health from a harm reduction point of view, but also for protecting youth from criminalization and teaching them how to navigate the system. And I think I can only really speak for myself and my family, but I learned from a pretty young age what it means to like finesse the system and to code switch and to learn what it means to present in a particular way to prevent myself from being at risk, at least to the point where, of course, I'm still at risk. Respectability politics doesn't save you, but I think if we teach youth what the law is, and then we also teach them how police view them, then it prepares them, unfortunately, for a system that otherwise will take advantage of them. So I think that there is this need to be practical about the reality, even if it's not something we desire to be the truth. But we need to be practical when we're engaging youth from a health perspective as well as from a criminal justice and that type of perspective.
I mean, yeah, I mean, there's so many things you could say in response to this, and I want to do explicitly support everything that Chantal just said. The one thing that I think about is I think like the inequities that we see within this country, of course, we see everywhere, right? Whether it's transnationally or within different countries. And I think that the way those inequities play out internally also play out internationally. There was a recent statement released by, I believe, the director of the World Health Organization stating that 39 million doses of the coronavirus vaccine had been administered in wealthy countries, while only 25, I believe, had been administered in a single poor country. That's a sort of grievous, vivid demonstration of the sort of inequities that we've been talking about, that you just talked about earlier, Chantal, that were revealed by the gathering of race-based data and the disaggregation of that data. And so I feel like if we get to a point where we like don't view borders as a reason to like close ourselves off to the suffering of others, then maybe we can also, while addressing those inequities internally, try to seek to address them externally as well. Because I don't think that you can look at that statistic, that 39 million versus 25. I don't think you can accept that if you believe that the people on the 25 side are human. I don't think you can accept it if you truly believe that they're human the way you are. And if you don't, then you can't believe that the people that are like them, even if they live near you, you can't believe that they're human either, because you it's just, I just feel like you inculcate all of these things based on the grievous inequity in the world. And so, yeah, I think that I just feel like those things have to be simultaneous.
Definitely, Chantel and Chuka had really great points. The only thing I would like to add is, in my opinion, racial justice. Oh, that's definitely that's a whole hour-long stream in itself. How can we see racial justice finally done in this country? I think what we need to shift our thinking towards is, how do we cultivate a society that values racial justice? And really, the bottom line is, you need to be willing to look at facts. You need to be willing to look at uncomfortable numbers. You need to be willing to maybe look internally. You need to be willing to look at the policies. Definitely super fun stuff I know everybody wants to do. But the fact is that there's a really common saying around the time of Black Lives Matters that they're oh jeepers, I just about lost it. So let's actually swing to Canada. Justin Trudeau campaigned on truth and reconciliation. We've definitely had a lot of him pushing reconciliation and very little truth. So we need to be willing to look at the truth. So we need to be willing to look at Canada's role in removing Indigenous people from their lands, and in a way, essentially confining them to reservations. We need to look at Canada's role in slavery, and the fact that much like America, a lot of this country was built using slavery. So there, we definitely we won't see a culture where racial justice is valued in this country until we see a culture where those truths that Canada so often likes to sweep under the rug is valued.
Those are really great points. We are reaching at the end of our event. So I'd like the panelists to kind of address any closing remarks, anything they'd like to talk about before we close out.
I will say that I've joined today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'm grateful to have been able to participate, and thank you to the other panelists, to Amina and Kia, for organizing this and hosting, and to everybody who watched. Thanks.
I'll also just say thank you so much for the opportunity to engage in this conversation. And I think for those who are watching, that this is a learning process, and for some of you this might be the first time you're watching a conversation like this, and for others this might be something that you've lived in a way that I've never lived. So regardless of where you are on that spectrum, I think there's a sense of gratitude and the willingness to learn and to engage, and I just want to encourage that to be the process or the mindset you go into all of this with.
I just wanted to say thank you so much to Chuka and Chantel and Kia and Amina. I've learned a lot today from our discussion here. So thank you both today for your time, and thank you all today rather for your time. And I want to say, even though this is called Ask the Experts panel, I definitely don't consider myself an expert on these topics in any way. Like Chantel said, it's definitely a continuous learning process, and I'm happy to be here today to share with you all what I have learned. But definitely, I still have a lot more to learn, and again, thank you all for helping me a little bit further on that journey today.
Yeah, and thank you all for being here. Even if you don't consider yourself an expert, your lived experience is as valuable as being an expert. So this is a live recording, and once again, it will be available if you want to rewatch anything on the Cannabis and Psychosis website and the Youth Rex Knowledge Hub. Thank you all for being here. It's been such a riveting discussion. Have a good night.